Hi, this is Swapnil Bhatia, and welcome to another edition of Dear Fire Insights. And today we have with us once again Pete Jarvis, Vice President of Business Development at Polyverse. Pete, welcome to the show once again.
Hey, Swapnil, always good to talk to you and great to see you again.
Likewise. If you see, we are it's hard to see where we are in this crisis. There are still medical challenges, the curve is still, trying to be flattened, but governments have started to open the economies in many countries. Within the US, we have started opening a lot of states. And if you look at the post-COVID-19 world, what kind of implications there will be for cybersecurity? Because a lot of workforces will move remotely. It will be a distributed workforce. So talk about, in general, how the world will look like.
So there's sort of three main themes to me. So one is there's the concept of privacy is going to fundamentally change, right? So that's the first component. The second component then is that depending on the industry, the way in which you look at security, I think, is also going to fundamentally change because the nature of business operations is changing completely in light of COVID-19. I was joking with a friend of mine recently. I said, if I'd come to you, 4 months ago and said, hey, I want you to install an application on your mobile phone that will track exactly who you interact with. And it will tell us, even if it's anonymized, that we know exactly who you touch base with, when you did it, and where. And I said, can you install that application on your phone? And today, most people would say, yes. 6 months ago, they wouldn't. And then the other component of it is then you look at the second component, which is 6 months ago, people would turn around and say, oh, we don't have a workforce that works from home or works remotely. And nowadays, the majority of businesses are looking at how they can do that. Classic example is within 8 weeks, T-Mobile had moved all of their call centers to be remote. And normally you'd have 300 people in a room, and now literally they've moved everyone to work from home. And then the final component of it is this aspect of information and exploitation of information. Because what's happened is everyone wants to know about what's going on with COVID. And so they're constantly trying to find information. And there was a beautiful example of someone developing an app that's really good that gives you all the local information on COVID. And it also mines your phone for all of the information, and everyone installed it. So if you take those three components, now you see a fundamental difference in the security profile, because what's happened is that where before you had this concept of a wall where you had people working in a building, all of the devices, etc., were well understood and well tracked. You've moved to this amorphous environment of security where you no longer have defenses. And I would argue that, firewalls, etc., nowadays really aren't a defense, nor is antivirus software in many ways. So you come to this conclusion where you're saying, wow, it's fundamentally changed the way we do work, which fundamentally changes the way you look at security. So you have these three components, which is one, your concept of privacy is gone. Two, your concept of a secure firewall or a secure environment, I think, is gone. And then the third one is essentially now that you're looking at an environment where you're going to really have to amp up the training and understanding around the type of information people are trying to get access to, because the phishing attacks have exploded since COVID has come on board.
As companies, move to this uncharted territory, some companies already operate in work from home mode or remote, but many don't. And that also means a lot of, unknown things will happen that we don't know how to deal with them. There is a technical problem, and then there is a people's problem, and people problem is harder to manage. When you're in a corporate environment, there are a lot of things that you just can't do. But when you are working remotely from your laptop at home, there are a lot of things you may do. You may download something. You might also have a Google Drive. You might try to put something in a cloud. So can you talk about a few, it's too early to say that, but still, what are the kind of either do's or don'ts for companies to kind of enforce that, hey, you should not do this when you're working remotely, or these are the best practices?
So some of the best practices really come down to, there's a lot of education that's going to happen. I mean, give you an example. One of the things that's fundamentally changed is that now you're using your own laptop or in your own environment, etc. So on the technical side, you're connected to a VPN. And that means that the company have policies that you have to follow. And a lot of people forget this. They're going, oh, well, I'm working from home, so my environment is mine. But the issue is if you're working on the corporate VPN, where you go, what you look at, etc., is being monitored. And I think one of the key things you have to do is educate people around that. And then the other thing that's really interesting is the time model about home involvement is very different. So give you an example, there's a lot more interruptions, there's a lot less structure around the business function, but there's also a higher level of functionality and performance with a lot of people. But there's a minority of people, right, who find that lack of structure really difficult. So if you break it into the two environments, on the technical side, now what you have is the environment that they're working in. Because if they're working out of an office, you have legal compliance, you have facilities requirements, you have structure. So small businesses and medium businesses now have to start thinking about the legal requirements of their home environment for their employees. And the other interesting bit of that is now you have this separate issue of all of the devices that they're using and the connectivity to their network, because home networks simply are not as secure. Right? So there's a question then about, well, if we put them onto a VPN, which is, the simplest way to do it in many ways, now what you have is you have a secure connection into an insecure environment. And so one of the questions there is that a lot of people say, oh, well, I have a secure VPN. You're going, yeah, but if the applications and the desktop environment that they're working on is insecure, and their children have been using that laptop, because they probably will, you have a much higher threat exposure from home-based devices. Because if I can get into the home network, and generally if they haven't set their passwords on Wi-Fi or if they got the default passwords, if I'm looking to get access to someone, it's much easier if they're working off a home environment. And it gets even more interesting when you're on a public Wi-Fi network. So now what you have to do is the security policies for the business become paramount on the way in which the person is interacting with their devices, and also about the security policies for using those devices. So give you an example, if you're using an iPhone and you're accessing the corporate network, or you're looking for documents, there's a perception that is relatively secure. But if I then copy that information onto a home laptop or onto a home network address storage device, also if my backups aren't secured at home, someone potentially can get access to those. Then they can get my passwords. And now if they have the passwords, they can log into my device, and then they can get access to the corporate network over the VPN. So there's a lot of changes that you have to start to think about, which is about the fact that all of the user profiles and the user policies have changed and their user actions have changed. So, for example, 6 months ago, if someone copied down a huge amount of files to their laptop, you would probably be raising alarm bells. The problem now is that if they're on a slow internet connection, they want to do that. They want to move it to their local environment. And that creates a host of problems for the security policies. And then on the social side, on the human side of it, now you get into some really interesting issues around HR policy and security, because one is okay, what is the policy around interacting on video environments? What is the policy for the way in which they can actually communicate with people? Time policies, etc., all fundamentally change. And one of the things that came up recently, and this is a sort of real example, is that now I don't have to target the corporate network. What I have to be able to do is start considering the phishing, because I can go onto LinkedIn, I can use that to identify the target employees. From there, I can derive how I connect with them. And at that point, then the question is can I actually go onto their home network? Because it's pretty easy for me to find their house. And if I can find their house, I can find their network, because they're probably using a Wi-Fi network. And that creates an entirely different threat exposure model for a small to medium business. And a lot of it, I think, that people don't understand is that a lot of people think that they're being targeted, but the model's actually inverted. It's much cheaper just to look for weakness. And so rather than looking for an individual company, which someone would probably charge more for, it's much easier just to look for weakness. And so now you get to a situation where you're saying, well, how do we actually monitor the security at the edge of the network? And what is our HR policy? And what are our monitoring policies for our home users? And that becomes a really interesting sort of opportunity issue. And the other one that I think really changes here, that I don't think a lot of people have really thought about, is that one of the big changes is that it's an entirely different work environment. And so I was actually talking to a friend of mine recently about this, and I said, look, your entire environment, the way in which you interact with people around the software development, etc., is different. And so I've got two examples. I've got one company that's loving it, right? They have adopted a completely remote worker environment. And before this, they were saying everyone has to be in the office, everyone has to work together. And now everyone's working from home. And that's working really well for them, because they've set up some really smart policies about the way they use Zoom. They've got consistent interaction with the staff on a regular basis. And they've defined policies and procedures to talk to all of the employees on a regular basis. So they're having a Friday meeting. The managers are having regular meetings with the staff. And then they're reporting through Zoom, which means there's a level of interaction. And then on the security front, you know, they've done a really good audit of the way in which they've got people connecting through the VPNs to the work environment. And they've been looking at how they can buy some software, etc., that will monitor the behavior of the people when they're actually logging into the corporate network and seeing if there are differences. The issue they hit is that a lot of the systems take about 3 months to learn the process, right? And so I think that that's really where you start to see some of the fundamental changes post-COVID. But COVID's going to come back. So you've probably got 3 cycles or 2 cycles. So we're going to have the sort of release and the interaction of people. But I think one of the things that people have to take into account is people actually have changed their behavior fundamentally. They don't want to interact as much. So I think the advantage of that is that some people are really going to be advantaged by the changes of COVID. Great example, this is real. There's a charity for small boats in Seattle. And, you know, there's a couple of others that raise money for their charities, but it costs them $40,000 to host one of these gala events, where they can run the same event on Zoom, and it saves them $40,000. So their profits for not-for-profits running a gift event, you know, event for a small charity, the profitability of running an event on something like a shared video chat like Zoom is massive, because they save $40,000 that goes immediately to the bottom line of the business.
Pete, thank you for those really interesting, you know, and important kind of tips for that. And it's not just applicable in this industry, you know, it's applicable for all the people who are trying to be functional and operational during this crisis and post-crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, I would like to talk about the people's side of the problem as well in the next episode. Thank you once again.
Hey, always happy to talk to you, Swapnil. Take care.